Law Enforcement Culture and Diversity is the title of this panel, and we're honored to have Malik Aziz, the National Chairman of the National Black Police Association. Seated next to him is Haley Gorenberg, the Deputy Legal Director, Lambda Legal, Kathy Harrell, President, Fraternal Order of Police, Queen City, Lodge number 69, and Barbara O'Connor, President of the National Association of Women in Law Enforcement Executives, excuse me. We'll start with you, Mr. Aziz. Thank you.
Thank you for having me today. I really appreciate it. I recognize or know several of you on the panel, Commissioner and Director Davis and Dr. Alexander. So thank you again for having me here today. The National Black Police Association, we're honored and proud to be here to present some of our thoughts that are pertinent to this national discussion that is occurring. Of course, we were founded in 1972 to increase the awareness of the community and to be the conscious of the criminal justice system. To enhance the quality of life in the African American community. Over the past 4 decades, we've played an integral part in advocacy and activism with what we delivered to the table. I stand on the backs of many men who founded this organization, ironically in St. Louis, Missouri, in 1972, after many trials and tribulations in law enforcement over 100 years or so, with very infrequent diversity inside those departments. Men such as Renault Robinson and Howard Saffold out in Chicago, or Alfonso Deal and Harold James out, are the 13 organizations that came together to form this august and noble organization. At the core of what I'll be talking about is accountability, responsibility, transparency, and trust, and I've heard that mentioned a few times here today. Some core points that got us here. One, the failure to diversify the police force. 2, the failure to engage in the community before an incident. And 3, deadly force encounters between the police and the community not being magnified enough. 4, no body cameras, not worn, not procured, or not turned on. 5, the misapplication of deployment of resources such as armored vehicles and chemical agents. And 6, failure to inform the public of the known and reasonable facts, giving way to social media to tell the story. 7, the lack of transparency in the investigative process. 8, the inadequacy of a grand jury and the DA's office to present or release information in a timely manner. 9, no indictments of police officers and police officer shootings of civilians over decades. And 10, the lack of a national clearinghouse to make this message one of unity to the people who we serve, public servants, and we don't want to separate the two. That I am a public servant, although I represent thousands of black law enforcement officers across the country, that I believe that we are public servants and we serve the public. So I would ask that this august body consider the recommendations to immediately create a national czar, a national chief, to bring in to some of the things in policing that I'll mention here very, very briefly. In the use of force, that we should not, no police department should investigate solely, alone, any police officer involved in a shooting. Along those lines, counseling for every officer, mandated that they receive counseling in a certain amount of days and for 6 months into a year, and put in some minimum standards of police officers involved in shootings before they are released back to the job. And a call for all police departments to engage in force science or some similar to train and teach the public about what happens in the use of force arena, and that includes activists and advocates and civilians, citizens, criminal justice practitioners, and defense attorneys, and create for all police departments early intervention programs that break the culture of having police officers go into a direction that is unknown when it comes to misconduct. Research and data collection, I mentioned a national repository, a national clearinghouse of information that we no longer should have to guess or do our own research when we have 18,000 police departments reporting crime statistics every year. But we take stats on all kind of things like how many sharks are bitten off the coast of Florida, but we don't know how many police officers involved shootings that there are. These are mainstays from under a national perspective. We would call for police departments to track all deadly force encounters and report them like they report their regular statistics. And for the Department of Justice to develop templates that would govern the release of not only suspects' names, but police officer names, that this scatters across the spectrum of some departments who release them while others keep them and never say them. This is not transparency that the public is demanding. We would ask that body cameras, that we equip our police officers with body cameras and tasers or less lethal methods to engage the public and be open with that, realizing that the massive funding that goes into data storage should be taken into account and should be funded or help partly funded by the federal government and private foundations. The diversity, which is a mainstream of my organization, which we have seen, and I was talking to the chief earlier, when we have to ask about how many blacks or how many women are in law enforcement, and we don't know, it further reiterates my point of having a national repository, a national clearinghouse for information so we can obtain it. And diversity in training and implicit bias training should be the mainstay in police department, understanding that we all have implicit bias and we're giving training, some none at all, others 2 hours. We have no national standardization of this kind of training that should not be washed to the side and played on a down. It should be put up into the highest echelons of the police department, and we would ask that all police departments mirror the demographics of their community. In many cities that we see, or even sitting in cities like this, in Cincinnati, we see a black population that is 45% or so, but a police department that is 16%. So it goes back to my number one point, that we don't serve diversity until a crisis occurs, and then we want to know how 53 our Office of Man department only has 3 blacks, and we ask the questions after the crisis instead of before. So we ask that happens. I think I heard the chief say it before, and they couldn't say it any better than I could. Demilitarization is on the forefront, but I would say that at no time should armored tanks be released on a peaceful protest. Then that is a failure of leadership. So I don't have the 1033 program. I've seen many checks and balances put in so far. We believe that more checks and balances are needed, and departments should show and prove not only why they need the equipment, but can they maintain it after they get it. And it is so important to some of the police departments who are cash poor that we in the fight for terrorism, we forgot about the other programs as cops that help the community, and we have to get them back both in the same line. Lastly, I would say that we understand what happens in our police departments when it comes to serving our citizens with whether it's 3 officers, 1,000, and it's meeting that, but we forget about the structure of supervisors, that so often we add police officers to the force, but we don't add supervisors, and we believe that ratio should be met also, that 7 is an optimum span of control, and we should look to making sure that we have adequate supervision in these departments that while we're diversifying. And as we've seen, for my last point before I pass it on, as we've seen in some departments, that most of the departments that are diverse, they are located in the top of 10, 15 cities, and the rest of them are scattered. And so we have no national standardization on what are minimum qualifications, while we watch people get washed out of the process at the door if their brother or sister has been arrested, if they have some low credit score, or if they smoked marijuana or experimented with marijuana when they was 14 and they did it 4 times, and the department across the way says, you're out of here because you smoked marijuana 5 times, not 4 times, but you can be hired at one department and not another. These are things that wash out people in the process, and we wonder why we can't diversify police departments, because as hard as it is, it's not an easy task. We're not doing some of the basic things across the nation, and we need a focus point. And I would applaud organizations from Major Cities Chiefs and Perth and IACP and Noble, as well as the MBPA and NLPOA and NLEO for trying to bring some of this into focus about what we need to do, but we need to streamline it. And for now, that's all I have to say. Thank you so much for hearing me.
Thank you so much. And next we'll hear from Haley Gorenberg, Deputy Legal Director, Lambda Legal.
Thank you very much for inviting me to speak with you here today representing Lambda Legal, which is the oldest and largest legal organization pursuing justice for lesbians, gay men, bisexuals, transgender people, and people living with HIV. Lambda Legal's policing and criminal justice work includes the landmark Supreme Court decision striking down all sodomy laws in the United States, challenges to sting operations targeting gay and bisexual men, advocacy to end criminalizing HIV status, and to end use of condoms as evidence of prostitution-related crimes. Cases on transgender prisoners' access to medical treatment and safety in custody, work to interrupt the so-called school-to-prison pipeline, and our recent national survey of thousands of LGBT people and people living with HIV focused on the community's experience with the criminal justice system and policing. Federal investigations of police departments and data from our sister organizations and Lambda Legal's own survey show us that we face some law enforcement agents who engage in LGBT-targeted discrimination, harassment, and assault. Police neglect also jumped off Lambda Legal's survey pages when we conducted our survey. And of our respondents who said they'd lodged complaints about police misconduct in the past 5 years, almost 3/4 said their complaints were not fully addressed. Many told Lambda Legal police neglected their reports of assault. And of those who reported intimate partner violence, nearly half of the African American, transgender, and gender nonconforming respondents in our survey, and more than half of HIV-positive respondents told us police failed to address their reports of intimate partner violence. These are highlights from our recommendations. We need LGBT-inclusive anti-profiling measures, and so we ask to extend the Department of Justice's new anti-profiling guidance to reach all federally funded law enforcement. And consistent with the recommendations of the Presidential Advisory Commission on HIV/AIDS, the administration should issue guidance to law enforcement condemning use of condoms as evidence of intent to engage in prostitution or sex trafficking. Policing agencies don't have a public health agenda at the core, so we need help from other quarters of government to move them on this point. And this is an area of, I would note, particularly rampant profiling of transgender women of color for what people have come to refer to as walking while trans. Next, we need to build culturally competent police forces. And Mr. Aziz touched on several of these points, and we certainly agree. The administration should ensure that police departments include sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, and HIV status in non-discrimination policies, guidelines, and patrol guides. And we need mandatory cultural competency training on LGBT and HIV issues with ongoing community involvement. We know from experience and from current events that training must address implicit bias. So why call out implicit bias? Well, we're addressing police diversity and understanding, and in our streets, police obviously hold much more power than the rest of us, but we are not safe unless the police power is informed. And I say informed because researchers who study our brain tell us that they are designed to be biased largely in favor of those with whom we are most familiar. But when a police officer has a gun in hand, training to counter this bias is a matter of life and death. So race, color, sexual orientation, gender identity, and other distinguishing characteristics require interventions if police who don't share those characteristics are to protect and serve. And yes, we should absolutely further diversify our police forces. Next, turning to ending sexual harassment and assault. Sexual harassment and assault by law enforcement officers is pervasive and often undetected. We need stronger policies to prevent, address, and document sexual harassment, abuse, and assault by local law enforcement agents. And because the people we serve are in danger in custody, anywhere in custody, anywhere they are held, we ask that the Department of Justice clarify that the definition of lockups in the Prison Rape Elimination Act regulations includes police cars and other temporary places of detention, any place that people are locked up. Next, a word about collecting information to promote safety and eliminate risk. We are wrestling with the question of numbers, of data. We know the old saw that if we're not counted, we don't count. But in the face of overwhelming reports of police abuse and concerns about what will be disclosed and communicated from a government record of sexual orientation or gender identity, we're concerned that demands to disclose during street and custodial interactions increase danger. So the bottom line, to protect the people with whom they come into contact, law enforcement agents should not be charged with mandatory data collection regarding sexual orientation or gender identity. People should have the option to provide this information for purposes of, for instance, safer placements in custody. Yet, we do agree that we need more numbers. So we are asking that questions about mistreatment of LGBT and gender nonconforming people be added to the Bureau of Justice Statistics Police Contact Survey and the Office of Victims of Crime National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey. Finally, policing young people in schools, interrupting the school-to-prison pipeline. Lots of our kids are seeing lots of police every day. The skyrocketing placement of school safety agents tasked from local police departments to schools has diverted school discipline from the principal's office to police handcuffs. Research shows us that LGBT and gender nonconforming young people are disproportionately punished by authorities. These extreme disparities do not correspond to rates of misbehavior. We urge that the administration ensure that police and schools limit interventions that push students out of educational environments to conduct that poses a serious safety threat to students or staff. And if police are to be routinely present in schools, they should be integrated into the educational community and used to connect students to community resources. It's not what's happening now, and it's endangering our young people. On behalf of Lambda Legal and our sister organizations, thank you very much to all of you for this opportunity.
And thank you. And next we have Kathy Harrell, President, Fraternal Order of Police, Queen City Lodge, number 69.
Good afternoon, Commissioner Ramsey, Ms. Robinson, and distinguished members of the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing. I'm very pleased to be able to be here with you today to share my experiences with the Cincinnati Police Department, as well as with my community during my time as President of the Fraternal Order of Police, Queen City Lodge 69, representing more than 1,000 police officers right here in Cincinnati. In December of 2002, the City of Cincinnati, the U.S. Department of Justice, the local FOP, the Ohio ACLU, and the Cincinnati Black United Front entered into a federal collaborative agreement. For the next 6 years, the collaborative, as we called it, did a lot of hard work to change the culture of law enforcement in Cincinnati and the image of law enforcement in our great city. Community leaders that spent years bringing lawsuits against our officers became some of our most important allies, and the FOP in turn took up their goals and objectives as if they were our own. So how did this happen? From the very start, the Monitor team and the FOP viewed the situation as unique, a real opportunity to show the law enforcement and the community could come together without resorting to a consent decree and resolve our problems by changing the way we approach policing in our city. The Independent Monitor's final report, which I recommend the task force review, explains the unique foundation of collaboration and the challenges of working under both the collaborative agreement and the Memorandum of Agreement, the MOA. I am proud to have been a part of our ultimate success. Let me first underscore the depth of the FOP's commitment to this process. We held a meeting early on, and our membership approved our involvement in this effort and the use of their dues to make sure we could have a representative at the table as the collaborative and the MOA took shape. We could have adopted, as our police administrators did at first, a passive role and waited for the results and recommendations to be produced. Instead, we put our money where our mouth was, and we made sure that we would be an active part of this effort. At the first listening session of the task force, our national FOP president, Chuck Canterbury, said we needed a holistic approach to the issues we've been discussing here today, because they are not law enforcement's alone. He also said law enforcement should take the lead. That is exactly what happened in our city, and I believe the collaborative to be a resounding success. Shortly after my election, I made sure to become a very active participant in the activities of the collaborative. I was the first union president to attend the all-party meetings with the federal monitors, mayor's office and staff, ACLU, and Black United Front. There was no question in the mind of anyone in the collaborative that the FOP was committed to the objectives spelled out by the two agreements. In fact, I am pleased to say that the FOP was on the front line advocating for a lot of the changes and recommendations to our own members, the mayor's office, and the department administrators. And do you know what happened? The shared goals and the obvious commitment to all of us had to changing the culture and the image of law enforcement in Cincinnati helped establish trust and confidence in one another. We developed mutual respect and admiration because we realized that all of us around that table had the same goal in mind: a better, safer city where all citizens felt welcome and secure. The impact of the collaborative, while important, was only the tip of the iceberg. The relationships developed among the FOP, ACLU, Black United Front, and other community groups, especially the leaders in our faith community, continue to show how deeply and powerfully we can change our communities if we work together. In 2009, when our department faced a series of layoffs and reduction in staffing levels, our partners in the collaborative joined us in protesting those decisions before City Hall. They helped campaign against the layoff proposals. It is hard to imagine that the groups that spent years suing the department now join with the rank and file to keep officers where they wanted them, in neighborhoods, protecting their homes and their families. Later, the then president of the local NAACP, Christopher Smitherman, sought and won a seat on city council. He did so with the enthusiastic support and endorsement of the FOP. Now he is chairman of Law and Public Safety and one of the biggest supporters of rank and file officers on council. He understands the commitment law enforcement has to our city and shares it, just as we knew that he would. During the FOP's effort to turn back Senate Bill 5, which stripped law enforcement and other public employees of many of our collective bargaining rights, our friends from the collaborative were active participants in the referendum effort to overturn the law. With support from nearly 62% of voters, we did succeed. Having been an active part of this effort, I don't think Cincinnati is necessarily unique. I believe that if law enforcement and the community can get together, get around that table, and work through the acrimony and distrust, you can replace it with mutual respect. We all acknowledge that we could do a better job at policing our city. The community leaders came to understand our commitment to the public and to their safety, just as we grew to understand their commitment to a safer city for all citizens. Once you have a mutual goal and trust in all of your partners, you can achieve whatever you set out to do. Over the course of 6 years, we did a lot of work together. But in a sense, the hardest work was done in those early months as we put an end to the mistrust among us. I want to make it very clear to this panel and everyone else who is listening, this was not an easy task. The amount of work that was done in Cincinnati for this federal collaborative was tremendous. But the hardest part was getting officer buy-in. Because I can tell you, being on the lines in 2001 for the unrest, Cincinnati police officers did not see that unrest because of basing it on race. It was not a black-white issue to them. It was about the blue of the uniform, how we policed, keeping in mind that the rank-and-file officers that were on the street and policing in Cincinnati were policing according to their OPATA certification, their policies and procedures, and the ways that they were trained. Al Gerhardstein was the face of the ACLU. Iris Rowley was the face of the Black United Front. We had the mayor, we had Chief Tom Stryker, and we had Kathy Harrell as the face for the FOP. We would not have been able to get anything accomplished if we had not gotten away from that table, because the true work was done by the Cincinnati police officers that were on the street. While we sat at that table trying to put together policies, trying to understand what the community needed, we wanted to make sure to our members that it was important to be at that table because the line officers understood and knew that changes needed to occur. And that was the best way to make sure that we had a voice, that those changes could occur, and we continue to do that today. Our officers are committed to the federal collaborative. Just because we were released in 2007 doesn't mean that our officers every single day are not out there making sure that they continue the work of the federal collaborative. The Cincinnati Police Academy does an additional 10 weeks above what OPATA requests. We have diversity training. We have cultural diversity training. We deal with additional training in dealing with the mentally impaired. We do community work. The work of the Cincinnati Police Department does not just stop at the academy. Our officers are dedicated. They're out there every day making sure that our community do work with us, and they will continue to do that. I am glad to have had the opportunity to discuss my experiences and those of the local FOP with this task force. I once again recommend you review the Federal Monitor's final report, which documents the success we had here in Cincinnati. Thank you very much.
And thank you very much. Next, we'll hear from Barbara O'Connor, President, National Association of Women Law Enforcement Executives.
Good afternoon. Chairpersons Ramsey and Robinson, members of the task force. Thank you for this opportunity for the National Association of Women Law Enforcement Executives, or NALE, to give you our recommendations to address the issue of culture and diversity in policing. As women leaders in law enforcement, we believe we bring a unique perspective to this important discussion. NALE agrees that our police agencies should mirror the diversity of the communities we serve. As an organization, we are passionate about policing in a fair and impartial manner. But in order to achieve this goal, we must increase the number of women in policing. As you may know, the national average of women serving as police officers has remained relatively stagnant at 12%. However, we know women bring a very valuable attributes to policing, and a recent study done in 2005 titled Women Police, the Use of Force by and Against Female Officers by Ashok and Rabi Hemp found that female officers generally use less force in police citizen encounters than do their male counterparts. Overall, the findings support the assertions that women and men perform policing duties differently, and that hiring more women as police officers may help to reduce excessive force. So this brings up two questions. Why do women use less force than men? But more importantly, can their techniques be trained across genders? In the following recommendations, NALE is not suggesting anyone make exceptions to women policing, and we're not asking for exceptions to the rules of the profession, but we are challenging the rules themselves. Our first recommendation is that conduct an in-depth new study and update past data to clearly identify and define the practices and techniques that have been proven to be effective and train all officers regardless of gender in those techniques. Recommendation 2, enhanced communication skills will lead to less force. Integrate into training and ongoing in-service education the art of effective communication skills. Our men and women who police spend far more time talking with those we encounter than we do with any other police procedure. We need to focus our training on de-escalation skills with the same vigor as we do training on the use of force and defensive tactics. Our third recommendation is, as part of this new training, we must add more emphasis on mediation, facilitation, interpersonal skills, along with emotional intelligence, cultural competencies, unconscious bias, and dealing with emotionally disturbed people. We know better communication skills will lead to public trust, which will minimize the use of force. Our fourth recommendation is we must place greater emphasis on problem-solving policing. These skills and strategies will go a long way to building trust and turning our culture from enforcement only to problem solvers. Again, I say to you, we are not asking for exceptions to the rules, but we are challenging the rules themselves. It is no surprise that we believe policing can be enhanced by increasing the number of women in our ranks. We also know that we're not the only leaders who think this way. However, as a society, we've generally not adapted to or encouraged more women to enter into policing. As a result, the overall number of women in policing has not risen. So our fifth recommendation is that the profession must shift its recruitment strategies to recruit more women. At the same time, we must ensure our profession makes the changes necessary to take advantage of the unique skills women bring to policing. I want to outline for you some of the challenges and issues we believe that prevent women from entering into law enforcement. The lack of a flexible schedule for those who wish to or already are raising a family. Physical fitness standards. All female officers must be able to control a situation when force of any kind is needed, but having the same exact physical standards for males and female officers does not make sense. Again, we aren't asking our profession to make exceptions to these fitness standards, but we do challenge the validity of the fitness standards themselves. We believe it's time for a paradigm shift. And I want to give you one example. Right now, for instance, the state of Wisconsin plans on instituting a new physical fitness standard. It has been determined that applying this new standard to one major city in Wisconsin, that 82% of the female officers currently performing the job well would fail to meet this new standard. The end result will be a decrease in the number of women in policing and ultimately a decline in the quality of law enforcement services to this particular community and state. Another issue is the lack of consistency on the physical fitness standards, and too much emphasis is placed on these standards. Another issue for women is they believe they can't rise into higher ranks and raise a family. And I want to close by saying that this isn't a gender issue, and although I represent a women's issue, this is really a diversity issue. So I think you can insert women, and as my colleague has said, this applies to African American, any diversity category. We have to create law enforcement organizations that are about quality and that represent the police profession well. And this is a national issue. I want to thank you for your time, and I know I stand between you and the end of the day, or at least part of the end of the day, so I will close now. Thank you.
Well, thank you, and thank all of you for your testimony. Now I'll turn to task force members for their questions. We'll start with Brian Stevenson, followed by Sean Smoot.
I just want to thank all of you for your testimony today. I really see this as a really critical issue in our efforts to improve 21st century policing. I've got really just three questions. To Mr. Aziz and Ms. O'Connell, I understood you to say, Mr. Aziz, that you have difficulty getting data about diversity within police departments. And my first question is there no mandated reporting of diversity, race, by police departments at the national level? That's question number one, and the same would be true around gender. The second question is, what can organizations do to better use minority officers to help with recruitment that you think they're not doing, that might be helpful to us as we think about best practices?
Yeah, well, first, no, there is no national, clearinghouse or repository for that information. Usually we do our own research. We're, scanning newspapers, departmental websites, trying to put things together, from search engines. There is, just like police departments report crime statistics every year, mandated for them to give those statistics. We don't have the same for diversity in law enforcement. So you wouldn't know what a city has in its demographics, especially. Some cities are very progressive with what they list. Other cities won't list it at all, won't say anything about what their diversity is on their department, and we have no way of knowing that. So I think that's the first thing. That's why I called for it, and my organization believes, just as you heard Barbara was saying, that there are certain things that women in law enforcement are Latinos or blacks, and we don't know, and we're asking one another about what is the new, demographics here. Did the population change with the census? Those are very important things for us. I think what departments can do best, though, to help, first is that they have to embrace the black or diverse law enforcement associations in their city. A lot of times over the nation, what we've seen is a stiff arm, a push away. They don't want to embrace any organization that has some ethnicity language in the title, as far as it becomes to come sitting at the table, or it comes to education and training. Those things have been put to the side. I think there's an example of one police department, I'll say, that in St. Louis, that the police department partnered with the local Black Police Association, MBPA, in St. Louis, and they gave them funds in order for them to go out and become part of the solution. You present a problem, they engage them to become part of the solution and help recruit and retain blacks in their city. I think that is, it's very rare or frequent that a department would do that and have checks and balances in order to get that done. I think that's the number one thing that we can do, is show that we embrace organizations who may be different instead of pushing them away because of some title.
Yeah, so I would echo that there is no data, and we take sort of shots in the dark to sort of figure this out. And, one of the statistics we talk about is that the number of women police chiefs is at like 1%. But there really is no hard and fast way to actually prove or disprove that particular number. In terms of recruiting, that's a whole another complex problem, because I think not only is it a matter of recruiting, it's then when you get them on, having them work in an environment that is truly welcoming to them, and then retaining them. And I think there are some departments that have done good work. I know, sitting here throughout the day, you've sort of asked for that. So I would point to Austin PD in Texas. They have about 24% women. I don't think it's any coincidence that Austin PD years ago was on the forefront of developing unique sexual harassment policies and allowing their female officers to report outside the chain of command. So I think that's a good example of, Austin PD does some great recruiting efforts, but they recognize it's not just about recruiting, it's about then what's the environment like within your organization. And you're absolutely right, your best recruiters are your officers that are happy.
And just one follow-up. I listened really interestingly on this question about reporting on sexual orientation and status. And I understood, and I just want to get clarification of this, that the organization right now doesn't believe that kind of data collection is necessarily critical. But I thought I heard you say that when interacting with people who are accused or suspect, that you did think it was appropriate for officers to gather data about sexual orientation and status. And I just want to understand that, because you can imagine the same challenges are going to emerge for people who encounter police officers who fear harassment or abuse or under enforcement if they report that kind of information. I'd just like to hear a little bit more about your thoughts on that.
Right, it's a very difficult thing to confront, and it's not just my organization, but other sister organizations, and we've sat around the table and we've talked about this because we know that data is very significant. Data can be a real driver, but we cannot figure out how it could be, and this is in consultation with community members, just widespread consultation, how it could be that we could have officers essentially mandating that one question you will ask in each interaction is, what is your sexual orientation or gender identity, without endangering people further. It's not a safe interaction. Furthermore, if that gets recorded and tagged to them, given the lack of protections in so many ways around the country, in so many states and communities, the idea of having a government record then that is in circulation potentially, that is tagging them this way, is pretty terrifying, actually. The flip side of it is that we know, and I talked about people being safe in lockups, we know that people need to have the opportunity to talk about what might make them unsafe and what could make them safer. And so being able to disclose your orientation, your gender identity, to talk about safety factors and where you want to be housed or kept, that is very important and also consistent with PREA, and we would like to have that extended to all sorts of lockups. And then because we do know that the data is significant, that's why we suggest that maybe from some of these widespread surveys, questions could be injected into the surveys to start gathering the data on where the problems are to further reinforce and guide problem solving. And that's the best we've come up with.
Okay, thank you.
Sean Smoot, followed by Jose Lopez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, President Harrell, I wanted to just congratulate you. And I mean that very sincerely. I work with police departments all over the United States, and not many have union leadership as forward-thinking as yours. So your folks are very lucky to have you,
Thank you very much.
Represent them. And actually, we've been involved in some situations where the unions had to fight to get into the monitoring process or get into a consent decree litigation. So I think that's just phenomenal. I wanted to talk about or ask about diversity hiring in particular, because this is not, this actually isn't a new or crisis-driven issue in my experience. I've been involved in law enforcement in one form or another since 1991. And even then, there was a concerted effort, a concerted concern about hiring having a diverse workforce in law enforcement. And that it has changed over the last 20-some years or so. But I guess my question is, can you identify a program that you're aware of, or a community that's doing a good job of recruiting a diverse workforce? I've seen communities that changed their educational requirement, went from a strict list, a rank list, to a banding to kind of open it up to a more diverse workforce. I've seen departments target advertising to the LGBT community, to the African-American community, to women. You all are up there, and I'd ask any of you to answer this question. You know, tell us something that you think really is effective.
Well, I don't think that there is a one-size-fit-all for this one. I've seen many departments across the nation without, from places that I've been, and usually it is in the top 15 or so cities. You can call out 7 or 8 departments who do certain things that progress diversification inside their city, while others, are not so good based on the demographics of their very own city. I don't think that you can add for instance, many departments are establishing black recruiting teams or Latino recruiting teams in order to go out and shoulder some of the burden of talking to their own. There are a few departments who are establishing Asian-based recruiting teams to meet the 1 or 2% that are coming on into their cities. So I don't necessarily see one thing that has been beneficial in many cities, while we've seen many cities either hit the mark on one ethnic group or another and fail to maintain on a few others. I think what is important for diversification is that this standardization is what you spoke of, that there are so many admission requirements that differ across the United States that literally you can go from in the city and county and have something different and be hired by one of the other agencies. Or there's no necessity in whether it's high school or GED or some college hours, or even upwards to a bachelor's degree, when many of us do believe that education adds to the integrity and progression and professionalism of your police department. But there's no standardization in any police department with subjective rules, some very subversive into the admission process, into the recruiting process, the background, and then the academy. So the washout for minorities is very real. Just because you get them to show up at the door does not mean that they will fail out in admissions, the background, the academy, and then the training cycle inside the department. So there's a very real existence of some kind of differentiation being made for people who show up and try to diversify in a police force. And many chiefs are doing a very good job of sending it out, while others are not doing any of those basic things that you would require in order to bring them in the door. And I will add that the job of recruiting is very difficult, especially in black communities, because black communities historically have, it's very real for blacks to look at a video and see dogs or fire hoses being, let loose in the South. That's very real. So that's just not 100 years ago, it's 40 years ago. And so so most parents are teaching their children to be doctors or attorneys or engineers into a profession that they think is a high mark, and policing is a backside based on the historical background of policing, our interaction or fail to interact with communities of color, and then you put that into the modern day context of that we still have to give talks to our children about how do you act when you're stopped by the police. So when you put all of these things inside of a mix, it's a recipe for disaster. So, Mr. Smoot, I don't know if it's one size, in my opinion, that fits all. I think that we have to mandate for police departments to do some of the very basic things, like just say, I support a diversified police force, and then follow it up with some type of action.
I would just like to add that in Cincinnati, we have a very diverse recruiting unit. And we do, as you stated, we do target certain colleges around the country as well as specific neighborhoods. We do advertisement on mass transit, et cetera. But I think that what needs to be taken into consideration is, in all the bad budgeting times, Cincinnati police was almost a 48% minority police department. And when we were going through our first layoff discussions in 2009, we actually had a city council member who was a female African-American that said that she believed she deserved a pay raise because as a minority, she had to work harder on city council. And my response to her was, well, you're looking at right now is one of your proposals demoting 25 sergeants, 18 of which are minorities. Will that make you change your mind? When we started looking at layoffs, because a lot of the number reductions that we're seeing in Cincinnati as well as around the country, we had 1,135 police officers in 2009. We now have, because we have a recruit class that's going to graduate on February the 27th, which will take our number to 1,009. Right now, we have about 950 officers. So, of course, when you look at that diversification and those retirements of over 180 that we lost a large percentage of our African-American officers, et cetera, and others to retirement. And that's not anything on the union, that's not anything on the Cincinnati Police Department. It's because of budget crunches. We haven't hired since 2008. We now have our first recruit class in. It's a very diverse recruit class. It's going to be, as I stated, graduating at the end of February, and hopefully when the budget continues to increase, we'll continue to hire more diverse classes, and I think that those will increase our numbers as well.
So I would just add one other thing. Generally, to become a police officer, although the standards are not consistent across the country, generally, you need to have never been convicted of a felony, a high school diploma or GED, take some entry-level knowledge-based exam, then physical fitness, psychological, and then a background. And there's no consistency across the board as to what those things are. And a lot of agencies give one test and it'll be valid, and they sort of work their number, as you said, down through the test for a year. I think with today's young people, that doesn't work. And I think, we just blew up our process, speaking personally at the University of Connecticut, because having people sit on a law enforcement list for 2 years just doesn't work. It's not the way young people think about their employment. So we're now testing actually every 30 days. And I would prefer to even go to an online testing process. And then I think, as a society, the police work isn't flexible. I mean, I think that's one of the things, I noted. And I think about this when you think back when we had the crisis in nursing, if you all remember that. And so what did nursing have to do? It had to become very adaptable to get women to go into nursing. And they changed their schedules and their flexibility, and that's something we just haven't done in policing. We have these rigid collective bargaining agreements, these rigid shifts, whether they're 8 or 12. We don't and still have issues around addressing women who want to have children in maternity, and you still hear the horror stories when a woman's pregnant, what happens to her in terms of policing, and then there's no flexibility to accommodate that temporary disability. So I think we have to sort of take a look at a holistic approach to this problem, and really ask young people today, why aren't they going into policing? I mean, that's the problem. And this current conversation, what's happening in this country, ask any chief, it's going to impact our recruiting for 10 or more years. Because it's not seen as the honorable, noble profession that we as society need to see it. And that's going to draw young people into this profession and a diverse crowd into this profession.
Thank you all very much. Jose Lopez, followed by Cedric Alexander.
Yeah, I have a couple of questions. First, related to this question of diversity. So we know that law enforcement over the course of kind of its existence in this country has largely been dominated by white men. And so this call for diversity, I think, is an important point to raise today, and we heard it twice on this panel in terms of kind of people of color and African Americans serving on the force, but also women. And so kind of knowing the history of law enforcement in this country, I just wonder, like the call for diversity in police departments isn't necessarily, it's not a new thing, right? It's something that people have been talking about for some time now. So the first question for Mr. Aziz and Ms. O'Connor, does it ever, in your call for diversity, does it ever feel intentional that it has yet to be addressed?
Well, that's a great question. I started in policing in 1981. I started the academy in 1983, and I would certainly tell you things have changed and they've gotten better, but I think we've kind of gotten to the point where we feel like, okay, everything's just sort of okay, and it really isn't. And I think we have to incentivize, whether that is through the federal spending power around grants, and do you look at the diversity of a police organization before you award a grant? Do you use the carrot versus the stick in terms of, having organizations put emphasis on this? Because it really comes down to ultimately the leader of the organization. You know, I was reading something recently that says if you want to get more women leaders, get women leaders. And I think the same is probably true about African Americans or any other diverse group. You have to have people in the organization that value, a diverse workforce and what that diversity brings. And I don't think we're fully there yet. I think that's why we have these problems with trust, whether it's across, any other diverse area. It's not just about African Americans or Hispanics or Latinos or gay people or transgender folks. I mean, we just don't embrace it and don't acknowledge it. I mean, there are only 500 women in our association, 500. There are a lot more women supervisors out there, but it's not something that a lot of people know in terms of our existence. And there are some chiefs who are great. I'll point to my colleague down at the end of your panel. He hosted the NALI conference, and not only did he host it at Tucson, he actually participated and was there. That's leadership by example, and we need more of that, and we need to recognize and acknowledge those chiefs who do that.
I would say, add to that, it hasn't stopped in my total of 26 years in law enforcement. I've seen the best and the worst. Calling for diversification has only been one end. The best thing that I've seen is when the public has demanded that police departments diversify. The worst of it is that what we see post Ferguson or post New York, where you come in, it comes into play. What is the demographics of your police department, and that gives rise to a new level of commitment in police departments for police chiefs to city governments to say we want to have a police force that reflects the demographics for the citizens in which we serve. But the flip side is that the citizens have to demand it. And police departments have to actually go out and do the things and set up the things that are very difficult, because we would all like to believe that the best qualified should always get the job, that this person is better qualified than the next, or there is some kind of underlying or undercurrent movement after that we become all blue and we're all the same. But we're not all the same in the eyes of you don't have to do a lot of recruitment for what is seemingly, what was said earlier, a white male-dominated workforce. There's not very much recruitment in that when out of 1,000 applications, 800 or 900 of them are white males, and then the rest is a very small dynamic. It hasn't ever stopped. Since I've been here, what I've seen is it change and take various forms. Either it's on the front seat, it's on the back seat. It's not mentioned at all. Crisis occurs. Let's do this. I would reiterate what I said before. Until we understand a national call, and I think, and I'll get this to Commissioner Ramsey, because he spoke at my conference too when I was in his city, and he did a great job. But until we have police chiefs, police commissioners, superintendents say, we believe in this, and we're going to do this, and we're going to establish teams, and we have the basic, most promising practices, the best practices and most promising practices, and we put them into motion from a national directive, from national organizations and a national government that says do these things, then we won't have to worry about 100,000 black police officers in the top 10 cities any longer. Then we can spread out a little bit more, or we won't have to worry about 100,000 Latinos represented in even less police departments. So I haven't seen it change in that kind of way, just take on various forms.
I'd like to try just a brief postscript, I know not from the law enforcement professional, but just to ask the group, if we're talking about recruitment, aren't we talking a little too late in a way? When we're talking about recruitment teams going out now to recruit to diversify, because I think that what we're hearing from the people that we serve in our mission is investment in the community before then, and presence in the community at community meetings and organizations, and knowing people and being connected there. And that if we had that kind of community investment and connection at a more felt level, that when the recruitment teams then form, they're going to find more fertile ground.
Well, can I add
That's
that
absolutely correct.
it's the first thing of saying, how do we do community-based policing, real community-based policing? That's what I started out with. When you have a failure to engage the community, then you have the crisis that brings in all of the other things that come to light. That's what happened before. I would say in community-based policing, that we would have a real and proper engagement, realizing that you don't have to be a particular color to actually do community policing in a neighborhood. All you have to do is care. But now we need to have people who look like us, who we can understand and see in a culture that helps us with recruiting. But you don't have to go in a community and be black or Latino or any other thing in order to show that you care. I had people work for me in the past. I've seen people who were white who cared, really cared, and helped people who didn't look like them, the opposite, and they loved them and they cared about their neighborhood as if it was their own. So we can't say that, and we won't use that as an excuse. But what we will say is that the public demands the demographics to look like them. When I was hired as a police officer, my mother said, "What are you doing? They're gonna kill you." She never met a good police officer in her life until she had me. And there I was. I am the best recruitment tool in my neighborhood. That's what I am.
If I could just add, and I think it's very important to say, that one of the main cores of our federal collaborative in Cincinnati, Ohio, was about community problem solving, community-involved policing. And one of the things that we have done in Cincinnati that has been absolutely tremendous is the amount of work that we have done in problem solving that we continue to do. And during the federal collaborative, when Al Gerhardstein, the head of the ACLU, asked for a year's extension because the city of Cincinnati and the police administration had not met that goal, but released the FOP at the same time because we had shown our commitment, that was huge. Because the main key, and I do agree, is problem solving and problem community policing. But I'd also like to go back to a statement that was made by Ms. O'Connor about the fact that collective bargaining agreements aren't flexible enough. I will say, as a union president for the Cincinnati Police, we're very lucky to have our collective bargaining agreements because they don't see color. They make sure that every Cincinnati police officer is treated the same, with the same rights, with the same grievance procedures, and I think that those are also very important when you talk about diversity and everyone being treated equally across the board. And our collective bargaining agreements have been very beneficial to us in Cincinnati.
Great.
Thank you all. Cedric Alexander, followed
Can I
by
ask a
Tracy.
follow-up question there?
Okay, quickly, yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow the first question up with an earlier conversation that we had talked about in regards to the duty to intervene. Checking either your peer officer or your department when you feel like something wrong is happening. And I just wanted to hear, as a black male and as a woman in law enforcement, when you are the minority, is the sense from the officers that you represent that it is harder to intervene or blow the whistle, even though you may want to?
Well, let me start out then. I can tell you from my perspective, it's never harder. It's about doing what's right. You have integrity, you have character, you have ethics, then it's never difficult for you to point out wrongdoing or to say stop. I tell officers who have worked for me in the past as their leader, then you are obligated to, if you love your brother in blue or your sister, then you are obligated to pull them back when you see them doing something wrong. And you are obligated by the badge that you wear, by the authority that's been given to you, to actually bring it to light. You are obligated. And once you have that leadership in place and you put that as a directive and a focal point, you don't have any difficulties in pointing it out. There isn't a code of silence. There isn't some thin blue line there that would separate and make it us against them when you believe that you are the community and the community are you. When you feel that way, then you don't have any difficulty.
And in some departments, I know it's different in Cincinnati, but if we have officers that want to make some type of a complaint against a supervisor based on, color or race, religious beliefs, or anything else, it's not handled within the Cincinnati Police Department. So they don't have to worry about going to a supervisor above them and et cetera. They go through the Cincinnati Human Resources Department, and the complaint is filed there. Then if it can go back to the police department, but if the member chooses not to have the police department handle it, they don't have to. It can stay strictly outside the police department and within human resources, which I think is very important.
So, and I would just add, I think it's absolutely right on the mark when you say it's about the culture within the organization. I think, and that's the hardest thing to assess. And I think that's the hardest thing for the community to assess. What's the culture of our police department? And I think if you build a solid culture where you say these things will not be tolerated, I don't necessarily think that that's a specific issue around at least gender. I think you just reinforce honesty. You have, systems in place where you check on officers' behavior, you know, trust but verify, and you hold people accountable, and you create that culture within your organization that respects, you know, people.
Thank you all. Cedric Alexander, and the last question will go to Tracy Mears.
I will stand down, Mr. Chairman. I'll ask any questions in respect to the time in our panel here as well, too, because those questions will be a little lengthy, and so would my remarks. So I'll let my esteemed and brilliant colleague, Ms. Mears, take any time that I have.
All right, so this is a question that I think gets to what Chief O'Connor was saying about making the job attractive to people, not women, just women, you know, people who have other aspects of their lives that they are concerned about, you know, whether they're women or men, you know, mothers, fathers, parents, children who have to take care of their parents. I mean, these are concerns for everybody. And I wonder, any one of you could answer this, but I wonder if one way of thinking about this is not just about changing shifts, but thinking about the distribution of who does tasks as between sworn officers and civilians. Do we think that we should really sort of radically reimagine who actually has to be an officer in order to get the job done that policing agencies need to get done, and might that be a helpful way to think about addressing some of these problems?
Well, that's so radical, I'm having trouble even following that, quite frankly. I think, you know, we in policing have, and a lot of agencies have done this, where you don't necessarily need that sworn law enforcement officer. So evidence collection, we all sort of watch these things on TV now and know that some of these folks are actually civilianized workforce. You know, you have records, you have dispatching, which used to be police officers, is now a civilianized workforce. I think there's a certain amount of the workforce that always has to be sworn law enforcement. And I think that's where it becomes challenging based on, you know, the structures of the profession. You know, we generally have gotten away from, let's use part-time police officers, yet nursing has part-time nurses.
That's why I thought about it.
Yeah, right. So, but is there a way, you know, radically thinking outside the box, as you suggest, that you have part-time or they're full-time police officers who pick a flexible schedule like we do in the private industry, and they pair up with another officer and then another officer, so the 40-hour work week is covered and the 24-hour shift week is covered. You know, that's the piece where we need to actually work with our unions and think differently about our collective bargaining.
Right, because everybody can't be treated the same in that world.
But if we continue to say everybody's going to fit into this box, then the number of people or the kinds of people that are in that box are going to remain the same. That's ultimately my point.
Absolutely right.
All right, well, thank you all very much. This has been a very informative panel, and please help me thank them properly.
Thank you.